This evening we'll be talking about M. Night Shyamalan's Signs from 2002. Along the way, I'll be making a few connections between Shyamalan and one of his predecessors, Alfred Hitchcock, who is a big inspiration in the way that Shyamalan sets up some of his scenes. Some of his slow pans where you're relying on sound and don't actually see much of anything at all. The reliance on sound, the slow pacing of some scenes harkens back to an older filmmaker. Hitchcock got his start in the silent era in the 20s and would continue into the talkie era, still in Britain, until 1940 when he came to Hollywood. And then the rest of his career primarily was in the States. He did go back to England once to make a film about a serial killer frenzy towards the end of his career, but most of his work that he's known for today was shot here in the United States. So he's a big absent presence in Shyamalan's work. So I'll be making a few comments about that. This film is shot in 1:8:5, so not something that's more cinematic and wider. It's brings the focus in towards for those close-ups oftentimes. He really likes to work with silence and emotional expressions on characters, and 1:8:5 works really well for that. So Shyamalan is from India, and this film, like most of his, is set in the United States. He does like to remind us that we are part of a global community. And as insular as the United States often acts, pretty self-absorbed we can be, he does his best to remind us of what's going on in other countries. And in this, he is following the lead of other people who've written about extraterrestrials invading Earth. H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds at the turn of the last century focuses on Britain, but then brings in other European countries at the end of the film. So most of the action takes place in England. Spielberg's adaptation of War of the Worlds is pretty global, right? You see what's going on in lots of different countries. In this particular film, we have a cataclysm that is going to affect everyone. But Shyamalan directs our attention to one small town 45 minutes outside of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. And we just get occasional glimpses of what's going on elsewhere through broadcasts on the television. He focuses us on how these four individuals in this one family are reacting to what's going on. And in this, he anticipates what Lars von Trier will do in the film Melancholia, which is also about an event which actually ends the Earth. A rogue planet smashes into Earth, and instead of seeing people running amok throughout the streets as they anticipate the end of human existence, we just focus on one particular household and how they react to this news. Something similar is happening here in Shyamalan's film. So a very narrow focus, which is useful for us trying to track the emotional journeys each of these characters are embarking on. But we do get the occasional glimpse, and we have this opening newscast, which tells us about Shyamalan's country of origin, what's happening in India, and then we get something that's happening in the United Kingdom and Mexico City, and Paso Fundo, Brazil, Amman, Jordan, Nairobi, Kenya, Beijing, China, Jerusalem, Israel. So a very broad reach is implied, though the action is focused on just this one little rural area. So the hero, the protagonist, the primary one, is Graham, played by Mel Gibson, and he is still dealing with the death of his wife 6 months earlier, and he's obviously very broken up about that, as most of us would be if we lost a partner, and trying to be the most present father that he can be for his kids, even though he is obviously dealing with his own mourning process. Sometimes he's talking to Colleen, and Beau overhears him, and she asks him about that at one point. So he's still trying to process away from his kids as well as be present for them. Now, whether he actually creates a space for them to grieve is a question, and we don't know what happened the first few months after the death of Colleen, but we do see that 6 months out, they're not talking about Mom a whole lot. He is a very virile, strong, athletic, swift man. We see him running to the aid of his kids at the very beginning. Remember, the film opens with his reorienting out of bed. He heard something that we don't hear, and he's listening carefully to see if there's going to be a follow-up. Doesn't hear anything, so he goes to start brushing his teeth, and then he hears another scream. And now we know what must have woken him. And he takes off with Meryl in tow to try to find the kids in case they're in danger. So he is doing what he can to provide a physical barrier between them and any kind of threat. But he's gentle. Even though he runs up to the scene, he doesn't start yelling, and he's not overly emotional. He's not acting histrionic. He's very gentle in reaching out to both Morgan and Beau to ask what's the matter, because he can tell that they're not in any immediate danger. And he reaches out. This is after Morgan has been forced to kill Houdini, one of their dogs, because he posed a clear and immediate danger to Beau. He runs up to this situation too, but he slows down. He will race to the crisis and then enters a different mode, right? His adrenaline is pumping, but he doesn't allow it to inflect his voice or raise his volume, or he doesn't look really tense in the way he carries his body. He looks very relaxed because he knows, he's an attentive father, this is going to be best for the kids, to help them relax and calm down after something horrible has happened. And here we see him wrapping his arms around Beau, the 5-year-old Abigail Breslin, who does an incredible job. It is hard to find child actors who act this well, this young, and she is one. And then she wakes him up at that later that evening, and he reacts without bitterness. He's probably pretty tired, but he does not get angry with her or short with her. Very gently, he asks her what she needs and why she wants water when she has some next to her bedside, and gets up to assist her. And he looks under the bed, because she said she saw a monster. She didn't say where. And we're probably wondering later on in the film whether she saw one of the aliens outside the window. Perhaps she's clued into something that no one else is aware of just yet. So he does what he can, at least in the first part of the film. We see him start to break later on. But at this point, he's very receptive to their calls for help and their emotional expression. He tries to meet them on the same playing field. So Beau, in addition to perhaps seeing the first extraterrestrial of the family, she is also attuned to other possible problems around her. And the way this has been manifesting since she was a kid, according to Morgan in that bookstore scene, is by identifying problems with water. It's kind of comical at times. She's like, there was a hair in it, or Morgan sipped from it and it has his amoebas in it. She's concerned about infections. And perhaps she's been sensitized to things that can kill you because of her mother's death. This is a possibility. We don't know really where this came from. Perhaps it has been heightened after Mom's death, but Morgan says she's been like it all her life. So she has this sixth sense, should we say, to quote the title of one of Shyamalan's earlier and most famous films. She has an awareness of things. She had a dream. Are you in my dream too? Now at this moment she thinks she must be dreaming, that what she just witnessed couldn't possibly have happened, and they just ran across a cornfield that's been leveled. It seems dramatically different from what they're accustomed to. They don't know how this could have happened, so that freaks them out. Here she's going on about a hair, and notice there's a collection of glasses here. Her father's trying to get at what's actually going on, and she has a reason for each of these containers not being ready for use. And at this moment, she says she doesn't want her brother to die, which really surprises him. He's like, why would you think that I'm in danger of losing my life? Later on, when he's gasping for air after he has an asthma attack and his inhaler is nowhere nearby, She says, "This is what I saw in my dream." It's almost like she's prescient, like she was able to see into the future and anticipate something that has not yet come to be. So even though she's the youngest, I don't think we're supposed to dismiss her perspective as erroneous just because of her youth. In what situations does her brother use his inhaler? Well, I started using an inhaler in 5th grade, I believe. So I was close to Morgan's age. And it was because of exercise-induced problems, right? Whether I was running around the playground, when I started swimming competitively, I had to use a Ventolin inhaler for quite some time, a Buterol. And that is not what we see catalyzing his problems. Here, the spark is fear, right? So right after he has to kill Houdini, he's trying to come down off that adrenaline high and takes this inhaler. And that's exactly what mine looked like. So this is very, very familiar to me. And here he's just received news on the television that these lights, I think this is the moment where the crop signs are appearing all over the world, and it seems either a really well-coordinated hoax that thousands of people are involved in, or something that's been created by beings from another planet, which is the more likely explanation, thus his drawing on his inhaler. So this is a way of signaling that he is anxious, even though he doesn't usually show it in his eyes or get really tense in his body. This is a calmer way of registering that he is uneasy. Officer Paskey is a secondary character who's important in the flashbacks because she helps prepare Graham for dealing with his wife's death, and also because in the present she offers a kind of steadiness that is sometimes lacking in the other characters. She shows up after he calls for her assistance 2 hours after he made the call, and she doesn't take offense at his tone. Oh, he's being very sarcastic here. Oh, that was quick, Caroline. She explains that somebody got upset and was spewing spit all over some skateboards because she just about got run over. And then she shows up later on to help the kids kind of reconcile themselves to all the strange things going on, to normalize what's happening. And so right before she debriefs Meryl and Graham about their encounter with the alien, or, we don't know it's an alien yet, but this intruder that they dealt with, she interacts with Morgan and sees that he's interested in her CB radio, and so she says, "You have an old baby monitor around. If you want to be able to listen to things that you can't see, perhaps you could use one of those and you'll catch certain frequencies." So she's coming down to his level. Here, she is encouraging Meryl for having decided to move in with his brother's family. Meryl has just said, "I don't think I'm helping much," right? And her response is, "Oh, you are. Just being here, you're definitely helping," which is not to say that she's unwilling to criticize Meryl, because later on he's being kind of sexist. He says, "I'm pretty strong and fast, and this guy moved much faster than I could, and I can't imagine a woman moving that fast." And she says, "Well, I've seen some Olympians who move really quickly." And he's like, "Yeah, right." This was, he's very dubious, and she says, I don't appreciate your tone." She's willing to use the voice of authority, but not in a way that compromises connection. She's still willing to pursue him and say, basically, "We don't know what you saw. I'm trying to get all the facts. We're exploring every possibility. Perhaps it was a drifter coming through town who was angry with some people in the cafe the other day." And here, before she departs, she's encouraging the family, and Graham specifically, to just help the kids get their minds on other things. We've already seen that the idea of some kind of alien incursion has Morgan using his inhaler. And she says, try to get them to just kick back and get their minds somewhere else instead of just watching things on television. Of course, Morgan and Beau go straight to the bookstore and try to find a book on extraterrestrials, so his mind is still on that subject. But it's an attempt on Graham's part for them to do something else, to get outside the house where they were threatened. Now, Graham has lost his faith, and we don't really know why at first. We do know that people like to call him Father, even though he's not wearing a clerical collar, and his response is to gently say, please stop calling me that. I am not a pastor anymore. He says to Tracy in the pharmacy, he's gentle, he's not rude about it. It's just like, this is not the way I identify anymore, the way I present myself. The exception here is when Ray, the one who fell asleep at the wheel and killed Graham's wife, calls him over and asks for help. And when he refers to Graham as Father, Graham does not correct him. He realizes that Ray is in a very vulnerable place, and he's not going to get bogged down in logistics, right? At this point, he still has that pastoral care, that instinct to try to help others, and he's more concerned about Ray, even though he's responsible for Graham's wife's death, than he is about his own, the nomenclature that's used to refer to him, right? So he just listens to him basically confess, right? What he did, because he's been wanting to talk to Graham for quite some time. And I think Graham recognizes this is a different kind of situation. In the same way that when he was talking to Tracy in that second image in the pharmacy, even though he tells her, I'm not a father anymore, he still listens as she confesses all her cursing and so on. And I don't think he tells her to say a few Hail Marys or anything after that, but he does act as the confessor, even though he's no longer wearing the collar. Graham apparently had formed a religious faith that was predicated on the idea that God would protect him. It's like, if I'm serving you professionally, if I've given my life to this, then you will protect me and mine. Instead of Graham's allowing space for trauma, like unexpected trauma that affects him in the worst possible way, that is not something that has been factored into his faith. All right? And this is clear because when he talks to Meryl, Meryl's looking for comfort. And his brother Graham says, well, there's two ways of looking at things, right? These lights in the sky. Some people are probably looking for a pattern, looking for a design. They're going to see something miraculous, and they're going to look for a miraculous intervention, right? The appearance of aliens, their advent, seems miraculous, and an apt response would be miraculous too. Some people are going to turn to God for refuge, right? For comfort. And he says that other people would look at all of this and be very afraid and not be able to find solace in belief in God, in the divine. And for him, he says, if I'm going to be honest, I believe that we're all on our own. And thus there is quite a bit of good reason to be anxious, to be fearful, because this is something we've not encountered before, and who knows whether humanity is going to survive this. So he's not able to offer the comfort to Meryl in this moment that he's able to offer before. And this recurs at the dinner table later on with his kids, where Morgan asks him to pray because they're all really scared, and he says, I'm not going to waste another second on prayer. So Graham is wrestling, though you probably noticed that when his son is having an asthma attack without his inhaler, Graham talks to God. He's like, I hate you. Why don't do this to me again, right? So there's a rejection of God's sovereignty, in some ways a rejection that God exists, but then in crisis, interaction with God suggests that he does still believe in God. He's just not sure that this God is a loving protector. What do we glean about Colleen's character from Graham's flashbacks? So she's another character who's absent-present in the sense that she doesn't really show up much at all until the very end. We see a picture of her in the opening next to Graham's bedside. Apparently, even though she's pinned against the tree and kind of aware of what's going on, her first question was, is Ray okay? When she realizes what's happened. He's the one that killed her, who's basically responsible for her death, and she's concerned about his well-being. So this suggests that she is a very loving individual, right? Not self-seeking. So a perfect pairing for a pastor who's giving his life to caring for others. She also repeats words that Ray said earlier. He said, in describing her death, there's just a few seconds where I fell asleep. If I'd fallen asleep at any other point, I would have just rolled off into a ditch, but it had to be right when Colleen was walking by. It's almost as if it were meant to be. She says the same thing. I was just going out for a walk. It's almost like it was meant to be. And, of course, this is an idea that Graham has difficulty accepting at this moment. He's losing a major support in his life, the woman of his dreams, his partner in all things, and he just can't react graciously in this moment or in the months to follow. She has advice. She's not thinking about herself. She's like, please tell Morgan to play games. It's okay to be silly. He is a very serious and somber young fellow, always concerned about what could happen, wants to protect Beau, right? Because his mom was killed, and so he's kind of stepped into the role of protector, following his father's lead. And he wants to learn more and more. So he gets that book on extraterrestrials. So a very studious individual. It's okay, she's saying, to let down your hair and just kind of run wild a bit and be a kid. And Beau, tell her to listen to her brother, because she recognizes that Morgan wants to be Beau's protector. And he makes that point to her. Morgan makes that point to Beau a few times in the film. And tell Graham, it's almost like she's not fully aware that her husband is standing in front of her at this point. Tell Graham, and he says, I'm here. Tell him to see. So his take on this is that she was just having random thoughts that were unconnected. This means nothing. Nor does the advice to Meryl to swing away. It's only at the end, when Graham has that epiphany, that he realizes that her dying words have practical use in a threatening situation once they find another alien in their house. So she is prescient in the same way that Beau is seeing into the future as well. Okay, this is something that Hitchcock likes to do. To set up a camera in one place and not allow it to pivot, not put it on rails so it's going back and forth, or tilting up and down or panning left and right, but to just frame a scene and then allow subjects to move in and out of that scene. Oftentimes today, particularly in action movies, what we do is we create energy by editing really quickly, shots that are only 1-2 seconds long, maybe 3 occasionally. So when you run across a film that has been really well choreographed for action, for fighting, it really stands out because so many people take the shortcut and just create energy by editing things, quick shots together really quick, really swiftly. This is not something that Shyamalan does much at all. And if you, like me, had been watching lots of movies in the 80s and 90s, lots of action movies, that was like my wheelhouse. And then you run across something like this that's able to create tension without all that cutting, without a lot of camera movement. It really stands apart. More people have done this since, but I think when Shyamalan began to do this in the 90s, not many people, unless they were indie filmmakers, were doing this kind of thing. Definitely not in blockbusters like Shyamalan's. So just one example of this we find in the scene after Graham has become convinced that there are indeed extraterrestrials because he just saw one. He saw the leg of one in a cornfield. And so he runs and steps into, he's a little bit calmer again. He runs places and then slows down, steps into the household. So a moment earlier, we just saw, Meryl in the foreground and his kids washing dishes in the background. And then Graham steps in He doesn't immediately engage anyone. He just kind of sits down, and no one interacts with him. They surely heard the door open, but no one is wondering why he's just sitting there not saying anything. But eventually they orient towards him. The kids turn back to look at him and stop throwing sides at each other because they were playing in the water. And Meryl, a moment later, turns towards him and then gets up and walks over to him. And the big reveal here is Graham's saying, okay, let's turn on the television, because he's been asking them not to, because he doesn't want them to become obsessed. But he's decided we need to know what's going on, right, out there in the world. Are there aliens landing all over the globe? So it does create tension. It creates tension within the family. And there are other moments like this. So whenever you watch a Shyamalan film, look for those moments where he just allows the frame to rest without moving, and then allows subjects to move in and out of frame, in and out of focus, foreground, midground, background. So why does he use an aerial shot to capture the family as they head into town? Well, let's think about first where else he uses aerial shots. So this is the camera pulling back for them as they're standing in their own cornfield where there's a crop sign, and the camera comes back far enough that we can see this design. And this obviously is the perspective of the aliens themselves. It's suggested later in the film that they're using these to communicate landing sites. And later on, the aliens do land near these signs. We don't know details about what the different symbols mean or anything like that, but they are signals that the aliens are using. And there's something else that these kinds of shots suggest, in addition to, the possibility of invisible UFOs flying in the United States airspace and all these other countries' airspace, because they do have shields. They're there invisible, and then they're invisible, and birds are running into them and falling to the ground. So they could be visible in these shots. We just don't see them. Their presence could be implied if you read their cloaking technology backwards into the film. They could be watching here as the Hess family heads into town to try to kick back and relax. There's something else, though, that is also potentially implied, and that's God's perspective, right? God is often configured as above ground, as in the heavens, in the sky, as having a broader perspective than our own. And bird's eye shots are sometimes referred to as God's eye shots, right? When you shoot from directly above your subject, whether it's a long shot like this where you're far away, or whether it's a close-up shot. The question of whether there is a God, whether the film is reinforcing the idea of the supernatural, is one that's introduced pretty quickly when Graham starts questioning God. The film ends up suggesting that something divine is at work, right? And we see in the closing shot that Graham has returned to pastoring because he has the clerical collar back on at the end of the film. What angles are used to capture the presence of the mysterious figure? This is the alien who shows up. Well, this is right after Meryl and Graham have run around the house yelling, right, to try to scare off neighborhood boys, which is what they're presuming at this moment. So the angle is slightly low, looking up at them, that grants them more agency, right? That's what low angles tend to do. Though not always in Shyamalan's work. Sometimes it just creates a sense of intimacy, because he uses low angles that are close-ups sometimes. Here, mid-shots. And then it cuts to a very high-angle shot looking down. This isn't quite a bird's eye shot, but it is a very let's see, level to the ground. This is like a 75, 80 degree angle, so very big angle, very high angle looking down at this athletic man who almost went pro, but for all his strikeouts, he is very strong and swift, and yet he seems very vulnerable at this moment because we're looking down at him. from the alien's perspective. And here the alien is scampering off into the cornfield, and so we have a low angle again, which kind of suggests that the aliens are shorter than Merrill and Graham, which we later discover is not the case. And we see them at an eye level shot disappearing. One of them is disappearing into the cornfield. I just want to draw your attention to some other camera work that Shyamalan is using. So swish pans can be used effectively. That's where the camera moves so fast as it pans that you can't really make out what's happening between where the shot began and where it ends up. You just get here bits of greenery as it's flashing across these corn stalks, and that's when Graham is out at night and reorienting towards the alien and actually sees one. Okay, so it captures the degree of readiness that he has and how swift he can move or reorient his head in response to a stimuli. This is a mask, and you'll remember this term from the first part of the course, where something is laid over the camera to replicate the perspective of a periscope in a submarine, or binoculars, something like that, or a keyhole, like if someone's peering through a keyhole. Here it's a telescope, because Morgan is looking up into the sky, presumably trying to find signs of alien aircraft. And he and Bo are pretty consistent in wearing these tinfoil helmets to try to avoid the aliens reading their minds, which is cute. That's one of the more humorous bits in the film. Sometimes pans, usually, they're much slower, right? And this is one of those moments where Shyamalan is really invoking the influence of Hitchcock. I'm thinking in Hitchcock's Sabotage, which is an adaptation of Joseph Conrad's Secret Agent, where we see a married couple. One is about to murder the other one, and the camera moves slowly around the room to create a sense of where one character might go to reach the other character. The suspense is building. There's a scene in Hitchcock's Rebecca from 1940 where one of the heroes is explaining the character of his deceased wife, and the camera slowly pans across a room, and you don't actually see through flashback what the character is describing, but you can imagine it taking place in this particular room because you're being asked to use your imagination. And he's just describing it, and you kind of see it take place in your mind's eye. And in Hitchcock's Rope, there are moments where things are moving in and out of the camera, or the camera's panning, and again, your imagination is being invoked. You have to supply what is lacking in terms of visual stimuli, and sometimes you only have sound, dialogue to go on. Here we have, in this scene from Signs, we have the camera panning from right to left. They just realize that they forgot to tie up Isabel in the garage, so Isabel is outside and vulnerable and possibly dead now that the aliens have run across the dog. So that's sad. The camera is panning across a room, just looking at the walls, this lamp, and then the curtains. We don't see any action, but we can hear these sounds, the clock ticking. We can hear the aliens scuffling across the boards of the porch and dragging their claws across the doors and trying to get in. So much relies on the sound design. And even though we can't see what's causing the sound, we know what's causing it, so we'd call that diegetic sound. Non-diegetic sound is sound for which there is no in-frame explanation at all. Like a musical score, for instance, is usually going to be non-diegetic. Or a narrator who's narrating a story and you can't see them. The basement scene is another example of our having to rely on what little is shown by the flashlight's beam as it pans around the room in the hands of one of the characters. There's a scene just like this, except instead of Graham being spotlighted, it's Morgan right before an alien reaches around and grabs him, which is pretty freaky the first time you're watching the film. So much is reliant on our imaginations. Again, I just can't emphasize that enough, because at one point we don't even get oral stimuli. We don't know where the aliens are. They're beating on one of the doors, thudding against it, but they realize, the humans realize that they're not actually trying to get in, they're just trying to divert their attention. So you wonder, where else in the house are they? And there's no sound to help you know, to help you orient towards the possible threat. So Shyamalan loves to suggest, to intimate without actually revealing. And this, I would say, is the hallmark of a really good director of a thriller or a horror film. It's always tricky when you finally show the monster or the killer. To make it still as frightening is a challenge, because oftentimes our imagination creates something that is much scarier than what is actually can be contained visually in the frame. And I wanted to draw your attention to the use of some pretty weird shots. So this is not when he has this big epiphany, but I wanted to point out to you that a wide-angle lens is being used here in a way that doesn't really draw attention to itself, right? So it's pretty wide. The fact that we can see this over here and this over here tells us, because of how close the camera is to Graham, that we're using a wide-angle lens. And you can see that there's slight distortion on the left and right as the image is pulled and stretched out to the sides. This is one way to use a wide-angle lens. This is another. So here there is just very obvious distortion. There's a lot of stretching going on here. And because we are so close to Mel Gibson, his face looks incredibly odd, and the shading on the left side makes it weird as well. So this is a wide-angle lens which is being used to distort, and that can be done intentionally to unsettle us. And the reason Shyamalan wants to unsettle us is because, and Hitchcock does this kind of thing too, is because there's about to be some kind of revelation. Something's going on inside Graham's mind. And it's not like being John Malkovich, where we're, stepping into someone's mind, where we're seeing things from their perspective, but we are entering into his cerebral space through this very odd shot that tells us that the wheels are turning, something's clicking, and this is the third flashback in the film where we see him interact with his wife prior to her death. We see her say what we already know: see, swing away. But we don't know what those things meant. But now all of these things come together and they actually mean something. He has the epiphany, and now it's a close-up without distortion. Right? This is probably a fixed lens, maybe a 35 millimeter, being used very close up. And he's about to say, swing away, to Meryl, right? I don't know that he sees everything, but once Meryl starts swinging, the water in the glasses comes into play. And then we find out that the asthma, which was probably seen as a curse up to this point, is a lifesaver, becomes a lifesaver in ways that I don't need to explain because you've seen the film. All right, that's it.